No one heard the empire crack when it began to break. On the night of April 18, 1775, the British Empire still believed it ruled the world by divine right, iron discipline, and red-coated certainty. From London to Calcutta, from Jamaica to Gibraltar, the sun touched British soil somewhere at every hour. Parliament debated taxes over wine. Kings spoke of colonies as children, unruly, loud, but ultimately obedient. Yet, in a quiet Massachusetts town called Lexington, beneath a moonlit sky, the empire blinked. It blinked when a single gunshot echoed across a village green. No one knows who pulled the trigger. History would later call it the shot heard round the world. But in that moment, it was simply a sound, sharp, sudden, irreversible. A sound that tore a hole in time, through which a new nation would eventually crawl, bleeding, desperate, and defiant. To understand how that shot became inevitable, one must go backward, into debt, into pride, into fear, and into the slow arrogance of power that forgets how rebellion is born. An empire in debt, a colony in chains. The British Empire did not sleep at the wheel, it was exhausted. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, known in America as the French and Indian War, had been a global bloodbath. Britain emerged victorious, but victory came at a staggering cost. The national debt had nearly doubled. The treasury was bleeding. Soldiers had died protecting the American colonies from French expansion and native alliances. In London, the solution seemed obvious. The colonies should help pay. From the British perspective, this was not tyranny, it was fairness. The colonies were prosperous, their ports were busy, their merchants were rich, their lands were expanding westward under British protection. Why shouldn't they contribute to the empire that shielded them? But empires rarely understand the psychology of the people they rule. In America, something dangerous had been growing quietly for decades, the habit of self-rule. Colonial assemblies passed laws, town meetings debated policy, local militias defended communities. Most colonists did not see themselves as subjects, they saw themselves as Englishmen with rights. And Englishmen did not accept taxes without representation. Ink, paper, and anger. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring printed materials, newspapers, legal documents, licenses, to carry an official stamp purchased with British money. It was a small tax. It triggered a massive explosion. Printers refused to print. Lawyers refused to practice. Merchants boycotted British goods. Mobs gathered in the streets, hanging effigies of tax collectors from trees. In Boston, a secretive group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty emerged, men who believed resistance was not just a right, but a duty. Among them was a man with sharp eyes, thin patience, and almost prophetic rage, Samuel Adams. Adams understood something Parliament did not. Taxes were not the issue. Power was. Pamphlets flooded the colonies, printed cheaply and read aloud in taverns and churches. Words became weapons. Ideas spread faster than muskets. For the first time, ordinary farmers and dock workers were debating concepts like natural rights, consent of the governed, and liberty. The Stamp Act was repealed. London sighed in relief. America learned a lesson. Resistance worked. Boston, a city under a loaded sky. Boston became the epicenter of tension, a city soaked in salt water, sermons, and suspicion. British troops were stationed there to enforce order. Redcoats marched through narrow streets. Cannons stared out over the harbor. To the soldiers, the colonists were ungrateful provincials. To the colonists, the soldiers were occupiers. On March 5, 1770, insults turned to ice chunks, ice turned to clubs, fear turned to gunfire. 5 colonists lay dead in the snow. History would name it the Boston Massacre. But even in death, propaganda mattered. Paul Revere's engravings spread across the colonies, depicting innocent civilians slaughtered by brutal British soldiers. Facts blurred, emotion sharpened. The dead became martyrs. Trust died with them. Tea, silence, and salt water. 3 years later, Parliament tried again, this time with tea. The Tea Act of 1773 was designed to rescue the struggling British East India Company. It actually made tea cheaper in the colonies, but it reaffirmed Parliament's right to tax America, and America was done being reminded. On a cold December night, men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. Without chaos, without theft, without a single injury, they dumped 342 chests of tea into the dark water. It was an act of theatrical defiance. The Tea Party was not vandalism, it was a declaration. London responded with fury. The intolerable answer. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which Americans would rename the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed. Massachusetts' self-government was dismantled. British troops were given expanded powers. Colonists were forced to house soldiers. The message was clear: obedience or punishment. Instead, the colonies did something unprecedented. They united. Delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia in 1774 for the First Continental Congress. They did not declare independence. They did not speak of revolution. Yet, they spoke of rights. They spoke of resistance. And quietly, across towns and farms, men began to prepare, not speeches, but muskets. The road to Lexington. General Thomas Gage, British military governor of Massachusetts, knew rebellion was brewing. Colonial militias, Minutemen, were drilling. Weapons were being stockpiled in nearby Concord. On April 18, 1775, Gage acted. 700 British regulars were ordered to march overnight, seize the weapons, and arrest rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The march was meant to be silent, but the countryside spoke. Riders galloped through the darkness. Church bells rang in steeples. One rider, Paul Revere, would become immortal, not for poetry, but for urgency. The regulars are coming out! By dawn, the village green at Lexington was filled with farmers holding muskets they barely knew how to use. Across from them stood the finest army in the world. No one ordered the first shot, but once it rang out, there was no going back. The empire bleeds. By the end of that day, British troops were retreating to Boston under relentless fire from militia hidden behind trees, stone walls, and barns. The unthinkable had happened. Peasants had stood against professionals and survived. The war had begun, not with a declaration, but with fear, confusion, and blood on the road. When the smoke cleared over Lexington and Concord, no one in America could pretend anymore. What had begun as protest had crossed an invisible line. Blood had been spilled by British hands, and British blood had soaked colonial roads in return. The question was no longer whether there would be war, but whether the colonies could survive one. Because revolutions are not won by anger alone. They are won by organization, sacrifice, and time, and America had very little of any of them. An army that barely existed. In the spring of 1775, the army surrounding Boston was less an army than a gathering of determined chaos.
Thousands of militiamen poured in from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. They arrived with hunting muskets, old powder horns, mismatched clothing, and no unified command. Some slept in barns, others camped in fields. Discipline varied wildly, supplies were scarce. There were no uniforms, no salaries, no guarantees. What they did have was anger sharpened by memory, memories of closed ports, occupied streets, and a government that refused to listen. Boston itself was still in British hands, trapped on a narrow peninsula and defended by powerful naval guns. General Gage fortified the city, knowing that if he could hold Boston, he could crush the rebellion before it matured. But Gage also knew something else. He was surrounded. The battle no one wanted, but everyone fought. On the night of June 16, 1775, colonial forces quietly occupied Breed's Hill, overlooking Boston Harbor. They worked through the darkness, building earthen fortifications with shovels and bare hands. At dawn, British commanders stared in disbelief. The rebels were not supposed to be that bold. Cannons from British ships opened fire. Smoke rolled across the harbor. Drums beat. Orders were shouted. Then the redcoats advanced uphill. What followed would be remembered as the Battle of Bunker Hill, though most of the fighting happened on Breed's Hill. 3 times British troops charged the colonial lines. 3 times they were met with deadly fire. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," someone reportedly said. Whether spoken or not, the order captured the moment. When the colonists finally retreated, they did so only because they had run out of ammunition. The British held the hill. They had also lost over 1,000 men. The message was unmistakable. This would not be an easy war. The man from Virginia. As news of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill spread, delegates gathered once again in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. They were about to do something extraordinary. They were about to create an army out of rebellion, and they needed someone to lead it. The choice fell on a tall, silent man from Virginia, Washington. Washington was not the most brilliant strategist in the room. He was not the most educated, but he possessed something more valuable than genius: authority. He had fought for the British during the French and Indian War. He knew discipline. He understood logistics. He looked like a commander. And most importantly, he was from the South. This was not an accident. If the war was to succeed, it could not be a New England rebellion. It had to be an American one. On June 15, 1775, Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He accepted without salary, only expenses. An army that barely existed. When Washington arrived outside Boston, reality hit hard. The men were brave but disorganized. Officers were elected by popularity, not competence. Enlistments expired in months. Desertions were common. Disease spread faster than orders. Gunpowder was dangerously low. At one point, Washington discovered that the entire army had barely enough powder for a few days of fighting. If the British attacked, the rebellion could end in a week. Washington wrote desperate letters to Congress. He reorganized units. He executed spies. He tried, against all odds, to turn farmers into soldiers. And slowly, painfully, something began to form. Not just an army, an identity. The quiet siege. For months, nothing happened, and everything happened. The colonial army tightened its grip around Boston, cutting off supplies. Inside the city, British soldiers grew restless. Food shortages worsened. Morale sagged. Outside the city, Washington waited. He needed artillery, and it came from a man who refused to accept impossible as an answer. Henry Knox and the Guns of Winter. Henry Knox was a bookseller. He was also about to perform one of the astonishing logistical feats of the war. In the winter of 1775, Knox led an expedition to Fort Ticonderoga, where captured British cannons lay unused. Over frozen rivers and snow-choked forests, Knox transported 59 heavy artillery pieces across nearly 300 miles. Oxen pulled them, men pushed them, ice cracked beneath them. It took weeks. But when the guns finally arrived outside Boston, Washington knew the moment had come. Victory without a battle. In March 1776, under the cover of night, Washington's men fortified Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston and the harbor. By morning, British commanders faced a horrifying truth. The rebels could now destroy their ships. General Howe, who had replaced Gage, prepared to attack, but a storm delayed the assault. By the time it cleared, the American position was too strong. On March 17, 1776, British forces evacuated Boston. The first major victory of the war had been achieved, without a final battle. But victory was an illusion. Washington did not celebrate. He knew what came next: New York. The English would return with overwhelming force. The largest empire in the world would not surrender a continent because of one city. And America was not ready. Not yet. As the Continental Army marched south, hope traveled with them. So did fear, because the war had only just begun, and soon the rebellion would face its darkest test.
The British did not come to New York to negotiate. They came to end the rebellion. By the summer of 1776, the full weight of the British Empire began to move across the Atlantic. Warships filled the horizon. Transports carried tens of thousands of trained soldiers, British regulars, German mercenaries, and hardened veterans who had crushed revolts from Ireland to India. This was not an army sent to scare farmers. This was an army sent to finish a war. George Washington watched the harbor from Manhattan and understood the truth before his men did. If the rebellion was going to die, it would die here. The largest force the colonies had ever seen. New York was a nightmare to defend. It was surrounded by water, cut by rivers, broken into islands, impossible to hold without naval power, which the Americans did not have. Yet politically, it could not be abandoned. Losing New York would fracture colonial unity and embolden loyalists, so Washington stayed. Across the water, the British assembled the greatest force ever deployed to North America, over 32,000 troops, commanded by General William Howe and supported by the Royal Navy. The Continental Army numbered less than half that, and many enlistments were about to expire. Worse still, Washington's men could see the British ships, day after day, waiting. Independence declared in desperation. As armies faced each other in New York, something extraordinary happened in Philadelphia. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted a document that transformed rebellion into revolution, the Declaration of Independence. It was not just a list of grievances, it was a philosophical gamble. By declaring independence, the colonies placed themselves outside the law of the British Empire. There would be no forgiveness now, no retreat. If they lost, they would hang. When Washington had the Declaration read aloud to his troops in New York, the reaction was mixed. Cheers erupted. Others stood in silence. They had just been told they were no longer fighting for rights. They were fighting for a country that did not yet exist. Disaster at Long Island. The British struck in August. They landed on Long Island with overwhelming force. British and Hessian troops flanked American positions through unguarded passes. Washington's defenses collapsed. Within days, the Continental Army was trapped against the East River. It should have been annihilated.
Instead, nature intervened. On the night of August 29, 1776, under cover of fog and silence, Washington orchestrated a miraculous evacuation. Boats ferried soldiers across the river to Manhattan, hour after hour, without the British noticing. By morning, the army was gone. It was not a victory, but it was survival. A general learns to run. What followed was a brutal education. The British chased Washington through Manhattan, then across New Jersey. American positions crumbled, soldiers deserted, morale collapsed. Washington learned a painful lesson. He could not fight the British the way Europeans fought wars. He could not win by holding cities. He could only win by keeping the army alive. Every retreat was a gamble with morale. Every loss threatened collapse. Congress fled Philadelphia. Loyalists gained confidence. The revolution teetered. The darkest hour. By December 1776, the rebellion was on the brink of extinction. The army had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 men. Supplies were gone. Enlistments expired on January 1. British troops settled into winter quarters, confident the war was effectively over. Washington knew that if he did nothing, there would be no army left to command, so he gambled everything. Christmas night. On the night of Christmas 25, 1776, Washington led his army across the icy Delaware River. Snow lashed their faces, ice clogged the water. Men marched with bloodied feet, leaving trails of red on frozen ground. Their target was Trenton, where Hessian mercenaries celebrated Christmas, confident they were safe. At dawn, the Americans attacked. The surprise was total. Within hours, the Hessian garrison collapsed. Nearly 1,000 prisoners were taken. American casualties were minimal. The effect was electric. For the first time in months, Americans had won. From hope to belief. Days later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating British forces in another stunning blow. These were not large battles, but they were perfectly timed. Enlistments were renewed, desertions slowed, the myth of British invincibility cracked. The rebellion had survived its first winter. But the war was changing. The British adapted. They shifted strategy, seeking to divide the colonies, isolate New England, and rally Loyalist support. And far to the north, a new campaign was forming, one that would test the revolution in ways no one yet imagined. Because the next year would decide whether the world would take America seriously.
Revolutions are local only until they prove they can win. By 1777, the American Rebellion had survived long enough to attract the attention of the world's most dangerous spectators. Kings, ministers, and generals across Europe watched closely, not because they loved liberty, but because they hated Britain. If the colonies could bleed the empire badly enough, others might help finish the job. But first, America needed a victory so undeniable that even monarchs would believe it. The British plan to cut a nation in half. The British strategy for 1777 was simple, elegant, and fatally flawed. They would sever New England from the rest of the colonies by controlling the Hudson River. A British army under General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada, while another force moved north from New York City. The two would meet at Albany. New England, the heart of rebellion, would be isolated. The war would be over. On paper, it was flawless. On American soil, it unraveled. An army lost in the wilderness. Burgoyne's army marched slowly through forests that swallowed roads and men alike. Supplies lagged. Loyalist support failed to materialize. Native alliances were fragile. Worse still, Burgoyne underestimated his enemy. American militias swarmed his supply lines.
Farmers turned into snipers. Roads disappeared overnight. Every mile south cost blood and morale. Then came the battle at Freeman's Farm. American forces, under the cautious command of Horatio Gates and the volatile brilliance of Benedict Arnold, struck hard. The British advanced, but at terrible cost. Arnold, furious at Gates's indecision, defied orders and led a reckless charge that shattered British lines. The battlefield belonged to the Americans. The myth of British control in the wilderness collapsed. Saratoga, the turning point. On October 17, 1777, surrounded and exhausted near Saratoga, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. Over 6,000 British troops laid down their arms. It was the greatest American victory of the war, and it changed everything. For the first time, a colonial army had not just survived, but destroyed a British field army. Across the Atlantic, courts took notice. France enters the war. France had not forgotten its humiliation in the 7 Years' War, nor had it forgotten its hatred of Britain. Now, finally, there was proof that the American rebellion was not suicidal. In 1778, France formally recognized the United States and entered the war as an ally. French money flowed in, supplies arrived, warships challenged British naval dominance. Most importantly, the war was no longer colonial. It was global. Winter at Valley Forge. Victory at Saratoga did not end suffering. That winter, Washington's army settled at Valley Forge and nearly fell apart. Men starved, they froze, disease spread, shoes disintegrated, soldiers wrapped bleeding feet in rags. Desertion haunted the camp. But something extraordinary happened. A Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived with a gift more valuable than cannons: discipline. Von Steuben drilled the army relentlessly. He taught formations, bayonet charges, and coordination. He transformed chaos into competence. By spring, the Continental Army emerged not just alive, but professional. The war expanded. With France now in the conflict, Britain shifted focus. The war moved south. Georgia fell. Charleston was captured. Loyalists rallied in the Carolinas. Brutal civil war erupted between neighbors. At the same time, American privateers raided British commerce across the seas. Spanish forces, though not officially allied, harassed British holdings. The empire was bleeding on multiple fronts. Yet the war was far from over. Because Britain still had the world's greatest navy, and America still lacked the power to deliver a final blow. The calm before the ending. By 1780, exhaustion gripped both sides. The British sought a decisive Southern victory. Washington waited. He had learned patience. He knew wars like this were not ended by constant fighting, but by moments. And somewhere ahead, one moment remained.
Revolutions do not only break empires, they break people. By 1780, the American Revolution had entered its most violent and morally tangled phase. The war was no longer fought only by marching armies and formal battles. It had spread into farms, villages, and families. Brothers chose different sides. Neighbors burned each other's homes. Liberty had a price, and everyone was paying it. The fall of Charleston. The British Southern strategy was built on a dangerous assumption. They believed the South was filled with loyalists waiting to rise once British troops arrived. In early 1780, British General Sir Henry Clinton targeted Charleston, South Carolina, one of the most important ports in America. After a long siege, Charleston fell. Over 5,000 American soldiers surrendered, the greatest American defeat of the war. To Britain, it felt like momentum. To the Revolution, it felt like despair. The traitor's bargain. While the war burned in the South, a quiet betrayal was unfolding in the North. Benedict Arnold had been a hero. At Saratoga, his courage had turned defeat into victory. He had bled for the cause. He had nearly lost his leg, but recognition had eluded him. Congress questioned his expenses. Rivals whispered accusations. Resentment hardened into bitterness. Arnold began secret negotiations with the British. In exchange for money and rank, he agreed to surrender West Point, a fortress that controlled the Hudson River. The plan came terrifyingly close to success. But in September 1780, Arnold's British contact, Major John Andre, was captured with incriminating papers. The plot was exposed. Arnold fled to British lines, and America gained a word that would live forever in its language: treason. A war without mercy. In the South, the conflict turned savage. British commanders struggled to control partisan warfare. Loyalist militias fought patriot militias in brutal skirmishes. Prisoners were executed, homes were burned, crops destroyed. One man thrived in this chaos. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, used guerrilla tactics to harass British forces, striking unexpectedly and vanishing into the wetlands. Another, Thomas Sumter, earned the name the Gamecock for his relentless aggression. The British won battles. They lost control. The tide turns at Cowpens. In January 1781, American forces under Daniel Morgan faced British troops at Cowpens. Morgan understood his enemy. He placed his weakest troops in front, ordering them to fire a few shots and retreat. The British, confident and aggressive, charged, straight into a trap. The American line held. Cavalry struck. British forces collapsed. It was one of the most brilliantly executed tactical victories of the war, and it changed the Southern campaign. Greene's War of Attrition. General Nathanael Greene took command in the South and adopted a strategy Washington had mastered. Do not seek decisive battles. Wear the enemy down. Greene retreated, struck, retreated again. British victories came at terrible cost. Supply lines stretched thin. Loyalist support eroded. Victory, once again, began to feel unreachable for Britain. The road to the coast. By mid-1781, British General Cornwallis moved his army to Virginia coast, seeking resupply and naval support. He chose Yorktown. It would be his final mistake. The moment approaches. Washington had waited years for this opportunity. French troops marched north. French fleets sailed west. For the first time, land and sea might align. The pieces were moving. The board was set. And the war was about to end, not with a whimper, but with a thunderclap that would echo across centuries.
Wars rarely end the way they begin. They start in chaos, confusion, anger, blood spilled without meaning. They end in silence, when one side finally understands that history has moved on without them. For the American Revolution, that silence fell at Yorktown, a trap forged by patience. In the summer of 1781, George Washington did something his enemies did not expect. He lied. For months, Washington had pretended to prepare an assault on New York City. Fake camps were built. False intelligence was leaked. British commanders watched the north, while Washington quietly marched south with French forces. This was not desperation. It was mastery.
At the same time, a powerful French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailed toward the Chesapeake Bay. For the first time in the war, the British Navy was about to be outmaneuvered. The net closes. General Charles Cornwallis, entrenched at Yorktown, believed the Royal Navy would protect him. He was wrong. In September 1781, the French fleet defeated British ships at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis's escape by sea. By land, Washington and French General Rochambeau moved in. Cornwallis was trapped. Siege of the end. Artillery thundered day and night. Trenches crept closer. Shells tore through British defenses. Food dwindled. Disease spread. Cornwallis waited for rescue. None came. On October 14th, American and French troops stormed key redoubts under heavy fire. Alexander Hamilton led one of the attacks, bayonet in hand. The final defenses fell. Surrender. On October 19, 1781, British drums played a somber tune as Cornwallis's army marched out. The story goes that Cornwallis claimed illness and did not attend. Whether true or not, the symbolism was unmistakable. The empire that once ruled oceans had lost a continent. A war that refused to end. Yorktown did not immediately end the war. Fighting continued, diplomacy dragged on, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. British taxpayers were exhausted, Parliament fractured, public support collapsed. The war was lost. Recognition of the impossible. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain formally recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. Against logic, against all precedent, a collection of colonies had defeated the most powerful empire on earth. What the Revolution really won. The Revolution did not create a perfect nation. Slavery remained. Native peoples suffered devastating losses. Women were denied political rights. Liberty was incomplete. But something irreversible had been born. The idea that governments exist by consent, that power is not inherited but granted, that ordinary people can challenge kings and win. The echo that never faded. The American Revolution sent shockwaves across the world. It inspired the French Revolution. It frightened monarchies. It reshaped politics forever. And it began not with armies or declarations, but with people who refused to be silent. The lasting truth. Empires fall when they forget the humanity of those they rule. Nations are born when ordinary people decide they will no longer live on their knees. The American Revolution was not perfect, but it proved something timeless. Freedom is not given. It is taken, slowly, painfully, and at terrible cost.
Winning independence was the easy part. Keeping it would prove far more difficult. When the guns fell silent after Yorktown, America did not step into triumph. It stepped into uncertainty. 13 former colonies, each jealous of its autonomy, each scarred by war, each drowning in debt, now had to answer a question no revolution had ever truly solved. How do you turn rebellion into a nation? A country held together by hope and paper. In 1781, the United States technically had a government. It was called the Articles of Confederation. In practice, it was little more than a promise. Congress could not tax. It could not enforce laws. It could not regulate trade. It could not compel states to cooperate. It could ask. States could refuse, and often did. The war had been won by unity born of desperation.
peace exposed divisions that war had hidden. The cost of freedom. The new nation was drowning in debt. Soldiers had not been paid. Veterans returned home crippled, poor, and forgotten. Inflation ravaged the economy. Foreign loans loomed. British merchants flooded American markets with cheap goods, crushing local industries. British troops still occupied frontier forts, ignoring the Treaty of Paris. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade. Independence, it seemed, came with invisible chains. The ghost of war. For many Americans, peace brought no relief. Loyalists, nearly 1/5 of the population, faced harassment, exile, and confiscation of property. Tens of thousands fled to Canada, Britain, or the Caribbean. Native American nations, who had largely sided with Britain, hoping to stop colonial expansion, were abandoned by the Treaty of Paris. Their lands were handed to the United States without consent. The revolution that spoke of liberty had not spoken for everyone. Shays' Rebellion, a warning shot. In 1786, the illusion of stability shattered. In western Massachusetts, farmers, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, were losing their land to debt and taxes. Courts seized property, prisons filled. They rose in armed rebellion, led by Daniel Shays. The uprising was small. Its meaning was enormous. The national government was powerless to respond. State militias struggled to contain the unrest. Leaders across America felt a chill. If the government could not maintain order, the revolution itself might collapse. The Gathering in Philadelphia. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia, officially to revise the Articles of Confederation. Unofficially, they planned something radical. They would replace it. Behind closed doors, men argued for months. Large states clashed with small ones. Northern interests battled Southern demands. Free ideals collided with the brutal reality of slavery. At times, the convention nearly collapsed. But compromise, messy, fragile, essential, kept it alive. The Constitution. The document they produced was not perfect. It was cautious. It divided power, balanced ambition against ambition, created checks, limits, and delays. It assumed human nature was flawed and designed government accordingly. When it was sent to the states for ratification, the fight was fierce. Supporters called themselves Federalists. Opponents warned of tyranny. The nation stood at another edge. Words that secured a nation. The Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, argued not with passion, but with reason. They explained why liberty required structure, not chaos. Eventually, the Constitution was ratified. The United States had a government strong enough to function, but constrained enough to fear its people. Or so it hoped. Washington's final service. In 1791, George Washington was elected the first president of the United States, unanimously. He did not want the job. That was precisely why he was trusted. Washington set precedents that mattered more than laws: peaceful transfer of power, civilian control of the military, restraint in authority. When he stepped down after 2 terms, he proved the revolution had truly succeeded. Power could be given back. What the revolution left behind. The American Revolution did not end inequality, but it cracked the foundation of absolute power. It inspired abolition movements, women's rights arguments, democratic revolutions worldwide. It whispered a dangerous idea across centuries: ordinary people can govern themselves. The unfinished revolution. America was born not as a conclusion, but as a question. Who counts as equal? Who deserves liberty? How much power is too much? Those questions remain unanswered, and that may be the revolution's greatest legacy.